Africa is where the human story begins. Today, the vast grasslands of the south are home to the Khoisan people. These Khoisan hunters may seem like supreme athletes, but most of their genes are shared by all of us. The human body is a magnificent machine, tuned over millions of years. The genes inside each of us date back to our most ancient ancestors, the first humans to walk the earth.
We have this incredible adaptation for walking on two legs, and that seems to be quite fundamental. And that seems to have evolved quite early in human evolution, certainly more than 4 million years ago.
Walking upright is a defining human characteristic. If scientists can understand how and why this happened, then they will have solved a big part of the evolutionary story. Upright walking led to a series of other genetic changes affecting our bodies and our behavior. But how did it enable us to become the primate that rules the planet? At Kyoto University in Japan, Professor Aishi Hirosaki wants to know how walking on two legs might have affected the bodies of the earliest humans. He studies what happens when macaque monkeys stand on two legs and walk.
I wanted to know how human beings change their way of moving to walking upright. To study this, I needed an animal that normally walks on four legs, but is capable of walking upright. So I decided to use a macaque monkey.
Because the macaque monkey usually walks on all fours, his attempts to stand upright are among the closest the scientists can get to the actions of our ancient ancestors, the first bipedal apes. The researchers use a pressurized mat to monitor the points where the monkey's foot hits the floor. The results show how the pressure changes from four-legged to bipedal walking, and highlights what else was needed for the earliest humans to walk on two legs.
The most important role of the hip muscles shifted to stabilizing the upper body. Chimps and other apes don't need to do that because they use four legs. But for humans to walk on two legs, it's essential to have muscles that stabilize the upper body.
Great mobility was something that would give our ancestors a giant leap forward. Throughout its history, our planet has been in constant flux. All species are forced to evolve by the never-ending changes in the world around them. Once they could walk on two legs, our ancestors continued to adapt quickly to changing environments.
Starting around 2.8 million years ago, Africa became a lot cooler and more dry. And that created an expansion of grassland habitats. So lots of animals that eat grass, the herbivores, evolved at that time. So there was selection for running 2 million years ago in order to become hunters.
Daniel Lieberman is professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University. He studies what needed to change to enable our ancestors to run.
If you ever look at the gluteus maximus of chimpanzees, for example, they're pretty small. But in humans, it's the largest muscle in the body. It's big. And we've done an experiment a few years ago where we showed that when you run, your trunk wants to pitch forward. But the gluteus maximus fires and pulls you back, keeps you from falling over.
Evidence in the fossil record reveals just how good our ancestors became at running.
This is a part of the skeleton of Homo erectus, who lived around 1.5 million years ago. And what's intriguing is that many of the features of the skeleton tell us he was a runner. For example, his pelvis has a very large area for the insertion of the gluteus maximus. We can look at the anatomy of his inner ear, which tells us he had a head that was really very well designed for sensing pitching forces. So he was able to keep his head very still when he ran. He had very large joints for the size of his body, much larger than you need if you're walking.
These changes to the skeleton took place over thousands and thousands of years. They led to the remarkable modern human body we know today. The truth is, we are all built for running, and to have the endurance to cover the long distances that are needed to hunt.
We walk and walk to find signs of animals. The way we hunt is to just keep chasing them. When the animal gets tired, we shoot an arrow made of bones, and then we catch them.
Walking upright and jogging and running, you can cover long distances very efficiently. So the prey will tire out, the prey will overheat, and it will actually slow down and eventually drop down with exhaustion. So this requires incredible marathon running ability to do that over long distances under quite hot conditions. And yet modern hunter-gatherers can do it in Africa, and our ancestors were doing it probably 1.5 million years ago. When you can walk upright, it's a great advantage. Your arms are free to carry things, to carry children. And tool making and tool using is fundamental to humans, and that may have driven the growth of the brain. Also, of course, once humans had the ability to make fire at will, this is very useful for cooking, and also it's a social focus.
All of these extraordinary changes came about thanks to tiny differences in our genes. But it wasn't until the dawn of the 21st century that we could truly explain the genetics of evolution. The idea of evolution started in the 19th century, when Charles Darwin suggested that species adapt and change. He came up with the theory of natural selection, survival of the fittest, to explain it. Darwin observed that some members of a species survive long enough to have offspring, whilst others do not. This difference is down to slight variations between individuals, giving some of them advantages that increase their chances of survival and reproduction.
When we look at the domesticated species that we've been breeding, our breeders are looking for these changes that happen to be good and are encouraging those. Natural selection has done the same thing in our ancestry. It's encouraging those things that happen to allow people to survive better.
Darwin's scientific theory was based on a lifetime of fact-finding and observations. but he didn't understand the mechanics of how these changes take place. It would be another 100 years before we found out. And it took another scientific revolution to get there, the game-changing discovery of DNA.
Once we knew the structure of DNA and how it was passed on, people could actually look directly at the mechanism by which evolution was happening.
The DNA molecule contains our genetic code. Its double helix structure holds all the information that makes living things grow and develop. Short sequences within our DNA determine particular characteristics, such as height, muscle strength, hair color, and fertility. These are our genes, and variations between them are the basis of evolution.
Selection works on individuals, and some individuals will have more children than other individuals, and so their DNA is passed on to future generations.
What natural selection cares about, what it's favoring, are genes that make you more likely to pass on your genes to the next generation.
Differences in the genetic makeup of our ancestors that helped them to survive were often favored by natural selection. And the process of sexual reproduction makes sure our genes are constantly being mixed up in billions of different combinations. When a child is conceived, half its DNA comes from the mother and half from the father. But there's another critical process for changing our DNA. Tiny variations occur as our cells divide. They're known as mutations.
Everyone living today is a mutant. Every new conception that creates a new person has 35 to 50, sometimes even more than 100 mutations that are new in the genome. And everybody carries these new things. Most of them make no difference to you. But when they do make a difference, they can make a really profound difference.
Mutation is critical to evolution.
Occasionally, a mutation changes the biology in a way that's good, or at least that increases survival or increases reproduction. And those things are what are positively selected. Natural selection sees those things and causes them to grow in the population.
Scientists continue to find many links between genetic mutation and evolution. The discovery of DNA was revolutionary. And at the turn of the 21st century, our genetic understanding surged forwards again. In 2003, the Human Genome Project announced it had identified the whole of our genetic code, the blueprint of the human body.
Our genomes were adapted for the last 6 million years to become the humans that we are today.
The ability to compare the genetic material of different people revolutionized our understanding of evolution yet again. Mapping the human genome means we can identify the differences between the genetic makeup of people around the world.
What's different between populations in different parts of the world is largely due to the genetic changes that have happened in the last 40,000 years.
And crucially for our understanding of how we came to evolve, present-day DNA can be compared with that of the past.
In addition to looking at living people and their variability, we now can look into the past by getting DNA from skeletons. And we can test directly.
It's just enabled us to tap in on these vast sources of information about our health, about our ancestry, and that enables us to get a much, much more nuanced picture of our evolution.
Human DNA, both past and present, shows how our ancient ancestors spread out across the globe and helps reveal how a changing world forced them to adapt and change. Scientists are now comparing our human genome with that of our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees. in search of vital differences. Those parts of the code that have changed the most since the chimp-human split are the ones that shaped humankind. One part of the genome that differs significantly relates to our skin. At Pennsylvania State University, Nina Jablonski studies the evolution of human skin.
In order to understand all of the human body, we must understand the evolution of the largest organ, which is the skin. Human skin is different from other primates in that it is mostly naked, and also human skin is very sweaty.
The evolution of the genes that relate to the sweat glands in skin was essential to making us superior hunters.
We're actually able to run at speeds for really long distances that make other animals have to gallop, right? And when we run at those distances, at those speeds, we keep cool by sweating. We extrude water all over our bodies, and that water evaporates and that cools us. And so we can run long, long distances in the heat.
Not all mammals are as good at keeping cool as we are.
But if you make a four-legged animal gallop, because those animals can't cool by sweating, they cool by panting. They have these short little shallow breaths, and it turns out that when one of those animals gallops, their guts slam into the diaphragm with every stride, and so they can't pant while they run. And so if you chase an animal like that, it will overheat and die.
When we lost our fur and started to sweat, it forced another turn in human evolution: the darkening of skin.
What we had to do was compensate for the absence of hair. So early Homo sapiens were very darkly pigmented, and the dark melanin pigment helps to protect against very, very strong sunlight, especially ultraviolet radiation. Because increase in the amount of sun exposure and ultraviolet radiation causes damage to the DNA in the skin. And some of that damage, if it is unrepaired, can lead to skin cancer.
Today, in the world's hottest regions, the inability of a body to produce the melanin that creates darker skin can be life-threatening. Some rare genetic mutations show just how vital skin color can be. If a mutation in certain human genes, the OCA genes, is handed down from both parents, then a child will be born with a condition called albinism.
It's a genetic disorder, and they are born without the melanin in the skin layers. And that melanin protects from the damage that ultraviolet rays can cause. And one must really take care of the ears here. Lesions. Ultraviolet damage to the DNA of the cells is the first stages, which can then develop into a skin cancer.
Sunscreen and even clothes may not be enough to keep these children safe. If our ancestors had not evolved to have darker skins, the harsh African sun would have become a real threat to survival. But early humans didn't just stay in Africa. Changes in their environment forced some to start moving north.
Climate change may well have been a driver. It may have been that they were following animal herds that were migrating into those regions. I mean, basically, they were looking for their next meal and where it would come from.
Darker pigmentation began to work against them.
Outside of strong sunlight areas, dark pigmentation is not advantageous because it blocks too much ultraviolet radiation. And you need to be able to absorb some ultraviolet radiation in the skin to make vitamin D. And vitamin D production is essential for normal health and reproduction. And so the people underwent very strong natural selection to change pigmentation.
As early modern humans moved to higher latitudes, they gradually evolved to have lighter skin. And when Homo sapiens arrived in Europe about 40,000 years ago, they encountered another group of humans, the Neanderthals.
If we want to really understand what makes humans unique, we need to compare ourselves not only to our closest living relatives, the apes in Africa, but to our very closest relatives, the Neanderthals.
Neanderthals had lived in caves across northern Europe for 200,000 years. They were well adapted to cold, but couldn't cope with erratic climate change. Archaeologists once believed the Neanderthals had become extinct more than 35,000 years ago. But with the mapping of the human genome, they're now able to disprove this. At the Max Planck Institute in Germany, Dr. Svante Perber scours ancient Neanderthal bones in search of their DNA.
We are like archaeologists. We make an excavation, but not in an old cave or so, but in our genomes. It turns out that all people that today live outside Africa have a little bit of their DNA from Neanderthals. 1 or 2% of their DNA comes from Neanderthals, and that clearly came over by interbreeding, that there were babies that had one parent, a Neanderthal, and one a modern human.
This interbreeding affects populations in different parts of the world today. Now, geneticists are trying to figure out what traits the Neanderthal DNA has given us.
In Tibet, there's an adaptation to living at high altitude, where there is little oxygen in the air. And one knows what variant of which gene confers a large part of that adaptation. And that variant turns out to come from Asian relatives of Neanderthals.
Although many advantages were contained within Neanderthal DNA, they weren't enough to win out over the advanced abilities of Homo sapiens.
Modern humans are special in their behavior, I think. We don't fully understand what aspect of the behavior, but somehow they are special.
It's these special abilities that enabled Homo sapiens to rule the world. Modern genetics is helping us understand how we got here. For example, when a mutation emerged in a region of the human genome known as AMY1, it triggered one of the biggest cultural shifts our species has ever known. AMY1 controls the enzyme salivary amylase, which enables us to start digesting starch in the mouth.
Humans are a little bit unusual in that we have many copies of the salivary amylase gene, and so that equips us better to digest starch. I think it's evolved in the last million years in connection with the use of fire, because the critical change in our diet that made it an advantage to have many copies of the salivary amylase gene is the point at which we started cooking starch-rich foods, particularly starch-rich tubers, because it makes it much, much more digestible.
And our big brains sucked up this energy in the form of glucose.
As we've evolved, our brains have got bigger. They've more than tripled in size. And that's going to place very, very heavy demands on our glucose needs. Now, we can meet that in different ways, but cooking starch-rich tubers would certainly be one good way of meeting those big glucose demands of having a great big brain.
Until 12,000 years ago, our ancestors survived as hunter-gatherers who foraged for food. But as our genetic ability to digest starch spread, we could eat a wider variety of plants, which could be cooked and even grown as crops. It marked the beginning of agriculture. Among the first to exploit our ability to digest starch were the rice eaters of China. Here, more than 5,000 years ago, rice was cultivated in Eastern Asia for the first time. Today, it's still a cause for celebration. For the local Hani people, October marks their new year. And New Year's Day sees a rice festival of extraordinary proportions.
For the Hani tribe, the new year is the period of harvest. Each house makes food, and then they gather and they greet the new year together. And sometimes there will be guests coming from far away.
This is the Long Street Banquet, the highlight of the Hani New Year celebrations. More than 800 tables are laid out over a distance of 1.5 kilometers. Across Asia, a diet based on rice has ensured centuries of healthy living. This Chinese grandmother holds an identity card which claims she was born on the 25th of June, 1886.
I think I'm over 120 years old. I don't really remember properly, but I'm getting on that way.
The rise of agriculture led directly to the growth of the human population.
With agriculture, there's a lot more food available on 1 hectare of land than out in the forest. So agriculture permitted a population explosion. The reason that we have 7 billion people in the world today is agriculture.
The AMY1 mutation enabling starch digestion wasn't confined to Asia. It spread across the world. In parts of South America today, people still take full advantage of the human ability to digest starch in the mouth. In Santa Rosa, Peru, corn is the main staple. This woman is preparing a local speciality. She chews roasted corn powder, which is partially digested by the amylase in her saliva. She spits the corn back out and leaves it to ferment into a drink known as chicha.
Chicha. It's alcohol made from corn. We like to give it to guests when they come to the house.
Chicha has been enjoyed in the Americas since corn was first cultivated some 5,000 years ago. Since then, people the world over have turned to crop cultivation. But while agriculture ensured a regular food supply, it didn't necessarily guarantee a better diet.
Traditional agriculture provided a much more uniform diet. So the first farmers were less healthy than the first hunter-gatherers. That's a paradox of farming.
Farming did not always make people stronger. Sometimes invading armies could exploit this weakness. Many genetic mutations affect our ability to digest food, and some may have changed the course of history. In the early 13th century, the Jin dynasty of China had the strongest army in the world. In neighboring Mongolia, the forces of Genghis Khan were tiny in comparison. With an army ranking 10 times the size, the Chinese Jin should easily have obliterated an invading Mongolian force.
Genghis Khan and his whole country probably had no more than 1 million people and about 100,000 soldiers. If you looked at China at that time, there were at least 1 million soldiers alone in China.
Despite their lack of numbers, the Mongol armies of Genghis Khan had a secret weapon hidden in their DNA.
Many people in Mongolia are lactase persistent, so they are able to drink lots of milk, which is incredibly nutrient dense.
Not all adult humans are able to digest milk. Many Mongolians had a genetic mutation which meant they were able to digest sugar from milk into adulthood. Evolutionary biologists like Mark Thomas study our genetic past to find out more about this mutation.
The one thing we do know is that it's been under very, very strong natural selection. It's given our ancestors, or ancestors who had that trait, a big advantage. I mean, a really big advantage. It's one of the strongest signatures of natural selection of any single gene trait in our genomes.
The milk-drinking mutation was common among Mongolians, but not among the Chinese Jin.
With the Jin, people were all using primarily carbohydrates. The problem with the carbohydrates in the short term is that the energy is depleted very quickly. They give you a lot of energy and then it's gone.
But Genghis Khan's warriors revived themselves with horse's milk and cheese. This made them leaner, fitter fighters with a physique built on strong, calcium-rich bones. And the Mongol soldiers didn't just benefit individually. The ability to digest milk affected their whole military strategy.
The Chinese armies, they often had to have as many animals pulling food as carrying people. So the soldiers often had to walk into battle because the animals were being used to pull carts and to transport food in very large amounts. The Mongols, there was none of that. Every soldier was riding his horse, and he had several other horses with him. And these horses served not only as a transportation, but also the food.
The Mongolians milked the mares they rode and drank frequently.
This gave the Mongols a great advantage. They may have only had 100,000 soldiers, but every soldier was a warrior.
Not only did the Mongol army make full use of every soldier, it could also travel fast.
So this was very important strategically in the movement of the Mongols. It gave them the ability to strike anywhere in the Chinese Empire. The Jin dynasty officials never knew which city would the Mongols hit next, because the Mongols could travel just as fast as the news could travel. The Mongol diet proved very advantageous for them in their battle against the Jin. So the Mongols had a great advantage, and they were able to use this in a strategic way in their fight against the sedentary people who depended on agricultural products.
Milk became the food of conquerors. The milk-digesting mutation spread fast. Legend has it Genghis Khan had many wives and hundreds of children.
The Mongol Empire was one of the greatest eras of cultural growth and also of physical and biological development in the history of the world.
But it came at a cost. As the victorious milk-drinking Mongols swept towards Europe, they brought death and destruction in more ways than one. The animals traveling with them carried virulent pathogens. Since the dawn of agriculture, many people now lived in densely populated towns and villages. Disease could easily spread. Keeping livestock had given protein to our diet, but it also brought disease. Where sedentary populations live in close proximity to animals, new diseases have the perfect opportunity to emerge.
Animal domestication had two consequences for diseases. First of all, it gave us the germs that evolved into human epidemic diseases. And secondly, it permitted the dense populations necessary for maintaining an epidemic disease.
In the early 14th century, a deadly epidemic emerged in Yunnan, China. It became known as the plague.
Plague is also known as Black Death because people's bodies would develop black blisters.
The plague traveled all the way across Eurasia, hitching a ride with the invading Mongol armies. At the Museum of London, curator of human osteology Jelena Beckfelitz studies the skeletons of plague victims in search of evidence of the world's worst pandemic.
This is a male and he's very complete. We look to see as many possible changes that we can in the skeleton which might indicate disease or stress or malnutrition. We'll also look at the teeth because the teeth will tell us things about diet.
The Black Death reached England in 1348. Here, people believed the deadly disease was carried by birds. Plague doctors wore a bird mask in the hope of protection. But nothing could protect the people of England from invasion by this new disease. In all, the Black Death wiped out a third of the European population. Beckfelitz's studies help explain why.
The thing with the Black Death as a disease is that we had never been exposed to that bacteria before, so it had a huge impact on us.
It was survival of the fittest in action. Any vulnerability spelt death from the highly infectious and fast-acting disease.
The symptoms can come on very quickly. You might be dead within a day.
But the populations that survived came out stronger.
Each time we're affected by diseases, then our immune response potentially gets better. So potentially each generation will have a better resistance.
The Black Death had a significant impact on European history. But elsewhere, the cost of an invading disease on a vulnerable population was much higher. More than 60 miles off the coast of Africa sit the Canary Islands. One of the smallest in the archipelago is the rocky outcrop of La Gomera. Here, a population of 24,000 hides an intriguing genetic past. The first clue to their ancestry lies in their unusual form of communication. The whistling language probably survived on La Gomera because for centuries the island population was cut off from the rest of the world. This isolation came at a cost.
The founders of the indigenous Canary populations, they would have started off with a decent amount of genetic variation. But if the populations are small for a long time, then there's an effect known as genetic drift, which reduces genetic diversity.
It's thought this lack of genetic diversity spelt the end for La Gomera's founding fathers. Known as the Guanches, this warrior race is today commemorated by these statues. To work out what happened, researchers first need to know where the Guanches came from. The Guanches mummified their dead. So when technology advanced and enabled scientists to extract ancient DNA from Guanches remains, it finally gave the researchers a window on the past.
We carried out DNA studies based on both teeth and bones, and what they prove is that effectively they have very similar genetic markers to those that are, or were in that period, in North Africa.
Scientists are now sure that the Guanches are related to the Berbers of the North African Maghreb. A modern-day local tradition seems to support this. Lucha Canaria, or Canarian wrestling, is thought to have originated in North Africa. It was brought to the island by the Guanches and takes advantage of the typical Guanche physique, tall and bulky.
We are Canarian, and we are the descendants of Guanches. And I am very proud of our tradition.
But how come these hardy warriors disappeared in the 15th century?
In 1496, the conquest of the islands was complete. And it ends because the previous winter there was a terrible epidemic. It was called the sleeping sickness of the Guanches. And the chronicles of the conquest indicate, among other things, that it was a miracle that no Spanish person was affected, but the Guanches died by the thousands. And so that's what makes us think that it was a disease that the Spanish were already exposed to. So their immune systems were ready to fight it, but the Guanches were not.
Like the victims of the Black Death, the Guanches were vulnerable to disease brought from elsewhere.
Some of the genes that are involved in immunity, we really want them to be as diverse as possible because that allows us to actually be resistant to a greater number of diseases. And so in the Canary Islands, the populations were relatively small and isolated for a long time, and so became genetically vulnerable to disease.
The conquistadors used the Canary Islands as a stepping stone to the Americas. And like the Mongols, the diseases they brought with them laid waste to a vulnerable local population. The full horror had only just begun. When the Europeans colonized America, the diseases they brought with them had bitter consequences.
Something like 90% of Native Americans were killed by European-introduced diseases to which Native Americans had no resistance, whereas Europeans had some resistance. Smallpox, measles, tuberculosis killed far more Native Americans than did those big battles like the Little Bighorn.
It would be several centuries before the great pioneers of modern medicine found ways to combat disease successfully. Throughout the 20th century, medical advances continued to increase our chances of survival, And with the turn of the new millennium, molecular genetics changed the story of our evolution yet again. In part 2 of The Evolution of Us, where are we going? How will our understanding of genetics control evolution and shape the future of humankind? The 21st century human body is no longer at the mercy of evolution. Cutting-edge science, modern medicine, and molecular biology could soon enable us to take evolution into our own hands. Now, scientists scour our DNA to save us from diseases that once would have killed us. Build vital organs and human tissue out of living cells. And delve deep into our genetic code to engineer the humans of the future. This is the start of a new era, the next stage in the evolution of us. Seven billion of us. Our species has taken over the planet. Millions of years of evolution created the amazing human body that brought us to where we are today. Now advances in science and technology have increased our lifespans significantly. And revolutionary discoveries in human genetics means soon we may be able to control the course of evolution.
We're at a period of dramatic discovery in terms of the effects of genes and how the environment too affects our health and our longevity. We can now project some about where our species is going, or at least what are the evolutionary forces that are going to be affecting our species in the future.
Around the world, scientists are already re-engineering the human body in ways that would have been inconceivable a decade ago. In the United States, Sergeant Ron Strang was one of the first to benefit. In 2010, Strang was a Marine in the US military.
So we were on foot patrol in Afghanistan, the town of Marja, the southern Helmand province. It's a typical day. We were walking down through the village on a street.
Without warning, Strang's unit was blown up by a roadside bomb.
When I had the IED go off, it went off on my right side. It clipped the muscle and it took it from about halfway up the quad to just below the hip, and took all this muscle mass on my leg off. I could see the bone in the middle, and the muscle kind of splayed out and just all red. So I knew immediately what had happened.
With his left leg blown apart, Strang was told he would never walk again due to the immense loss of tissue. A team at the University of Pittsburgh had already been looking at ways to grow parts of the human body in the lab. Ron's badly damaged leg presented them with a challenge.
Can you hold that up?
What we're trying to do is fundamentally change the default response to an injury. Our muscle on our legs, it's one of the few tissues in the human body that can regenerate from minor injuries. However, when you have a more major injury and you lose large amounts of muscle that exceeds the patient's ability to regenerate the muscle. So it needs some help.
Strang's leg was too badly damaged for his body to repair naturally, so the Pittsburgh team had to do it for him. They created a kind of scaffold for Strang's muscle cells to grow on. Made out of animal protein, it's known as an extracellular matrix. Surgeons planted the matrix inside Ron's leg, and when it broke down, it drew new cells to the area.
It sends signals to the adjacent healthy tissue that says, instead of simply treating this site as an injury site with inflammation and scar tissue, we should actually rebuild the tissue.
From there, Strang's own cells regenerated the muscle. And within weeks, Ron could not only walk correctly, he could even run. Strang's story is just one of the ways we're starting to reshape the human body. The Pittsburgh team's pioneering work is at the forefront of a bold new field of medicine. From robotic hands that know what we're thinking, to man-made hearts that beat on their own, we're designing the bodies of the future and starting to dictate the way humans may evolve. But our rapid progress in science and medicine is affecting the course of human evolution in more ways than one. The fast-changing world about us is increasingly out of sync with the slow process of natural selection that drives evolution. The environment in which we now live has changed more in the past few centuries than at any other time in the history of humankind. It all started with the Industrial Revolution. Throughout the 19th century, the age of invention swept across much of the world. It marked the beginning of the modern era and a new way of living.
When we look at the future, it's not about what we can invent. It's about what people choose to do with those inventions.
With its move towards machines and factories, the Industrial Revolution changed the way we work and play, travel, eat, and even think. The great innovators of that time also gave us possibilities we'd never encountered before.
We do things today culturally that were not possible in the past. In our past, we're limited because our technology doesn't allow us to alter ourselves. Today, we can create changes that will be inherited by future generations.
The world we live in today is unrecognizable from the one in which our ancestors evolved.
I can get up in the morning and I can spend my entire day without ever elevating my heart rate. I can take the elevator up to my office. I can sit in a chair all day long, staring into my computer. I never have to do anything. That's one of the effects of the Industrial Revolution.
There are few people left in the world who live unaffected by the Industrial Revolution. But for those who do, its impact on the human body is remarkable. In northern Mexico, high volcanic plateaus cut by deep gorges form one of the most extreme landscapes on Earth. This is the Copper Canyon, and it's home to the Tarahumara people, known as the light-footed ones. Against a backdrop of breathtaking grandeur, the Tarahumara make light work of the near-vertical copper-colored canyon walls. They run along narrow footpaths at dizzying heights for hours at a time. The fit, lean bodies of these remarkable runners are maintained by an environment that exploits the best in their genes. You have to be fit to survive here.
The canyons are deeper than the Grand Canyon, and the deepest is more than 1 mile deep, and it's very steep. In order to live in those mountains, you need to be able to master the mountains from a physical point of view.
But if the Tarahumara leave their traditional environment and step into the modern world, they face disastrous consequences.
In the big city, I can tell you they're nothing in terms of their health like the Tarahumara who live in the Copper Canyons.
The shocking transformation is an extreme example of a problem that faces many of us as we move further away from the environments in which the first humans evolved.
The Tarahumara aren't special. What's special about us is that we're abnormal. We grow up sedentary, inactive, we wear shoes most of our lives. All of those things change our bodies and make us the weird ones. The Tarahumara are the normal ones.
Through human evolution, the genes that have helped us store fat have been highly advantageous.
Human beings are actually, compared to other primates, very fat animals. And the reason we're fat, and we evolved to be fat, is that fat plays an important role in our reproductive biology.
For many in the developed world, an endless supply of food arrives on a plate. Human evolution took place over millions of years, and for most of this time we had to work hard to get even small amounts of food. So the process of natural selection favored genetic mutations that would help us store energy from the little food we could find.
We never evolved to live in environments where we had an excess of energy. Taking any excess energy we have and storing it as fat for when we need it. Everything about our bodies are a result of an interaction between your genes and your environment.
The mutations that helped early humans through times of scarcity cause metabolic diseases today.
When we look at ancient humans, they never had type 2 diabetes. It was something that could never occur in an ancient population because the surplus of food was not there.
Genes that worked well in our Stone Age world are out of alignment or mismatched with the way we live today.
A mismatched disease is a disease that's caused by a mismatch between our genes and our environment. There's lots of mismatched diseases which continue to occur.
Our history has left us this vulnerability, and it will increase in the future because the westernization of diet is happening everywhere. The United States now is fatter than any other country in the world, but everyone else is going our direction.
The rate of evolutionary change does not happen fast enough for our prehistoric genes to adapt. Nowhere is this more apparent than among the Tarahumara of Mexico. In their canyon wall settlements, the traditional Tarahumara live on a simple diet. They grind corn to make thick tortillas and a roasted corn powder known as pinole. Although the Copper Canyons can be very hot in the summer, freezing winters mean food may be scarce, so genes that help store fat become an advantage.
If you did not have that ability to store fat for those lean times, then you would die. So they actually need those genetic traits in order to survive.
Few roads reach here, and for many centuries the Tarahumara have lived with a near vertical transportation network. In their downtime, the Tarahumara compete in a staggeringly long traditional race. Springing up vertical ascents, the Tarahumara knock spots off ultra-fit visitors who struggle to keep up. These Tarahumara are still making good use of genetic mutations that date back to our earliest ancestors. But as soon as they leave, problems emerge. Many Tarahumara move away from the canyons and into cities like Chihuahua. When they move off the mountains, their genetics start to work against them, and they face serious health issues.
Those who have become urbanized and those who are living a life of abundance, for them today, what was once a way of surviving has now become a way of becoming sick.
Dr. Jesus Arguillas sees the downsides of the Tarahumara's genetic inheritance firsthand.
The main cause of death among these people with obesity is diabetes. In fact, the correlation is so strong that the term diabesity has been coined to describe it.
Martin Castillo is a Tarahumara man who struggles in a modern environment.
When Martin first came, he had several problems, one of which is that he is insulin resistant, which means he was already in the early stages of diabetes.
If he doesn't stop eating fats and sugars, his condition will worsen and eventually kill him. The problem affects not just the Tarahumara, but the whole of the country.
Mexico is the second most obese country in the world. Mexicans seem to have a genetic predisposition towards obesity, and the environment, their diet, and other genetic factors make this even worse.
Mismatched diseases are not the only way in which the Industrial Revolution influenced the evolution of us. Medical science is trying to come to terms with the diabetes epidemic. But for many diseases, discoveries in the world of medicine have already saved millions of lives. In 1862, the French chemist Louis Pasteur conducted an experiment that would change the course of human history. At that time, no one truly knew how diseases spread, and epidemics claimed millions of lives. Pasteur proved that disease was spread by germs and viruses. His discovery led to the use of vaccinations, which have been saving countless lives ever since.
This is the success of 19th century medicine, is that an enormous amount more people survive than would have done in the past.
Over the next century, the great pioneers of modern medicine continued to find ways to combat disease, helping our species to reach 7 billion today. This rapid rise in population is now thought to be affecting the way we are currently evolving. At the University of Wisconsin, Professor John Hawkes studies recent human evolution and the modern-day effects of natural selection.
Darwin actually predicted that when you had more individuals, more people, you would have more mutations and more chances of selection. And so the number of people that we have has actually increased the potential for change.
Tiny variations called mutations occur as our cells divide. When we pass these on to our offspring, they can bring about change. So could the mutations in our burgeoning population be causing evolution to speed up?
Mutations are, like a roll of the roulette wheel. You can have many bad outcomes, a lot of outcomes that, are not very bad or good, but a few chances of having something very good.
Today, scientific understanding of our genes means that we're able to change some of the bad outcomes of mutation. And some believe this could alter the course of human evolution.
Many times people worry that technology is letting people survive, and we have many conditions today that you can survive and have children, which in the past would have killed you. It seems like the force of natural selection should have stopped. But in reality, over the last 10,000 years, our evolution in that time has actually sped up. It's accelerated. And that's a really interesting discovery that we hadn't suspected before we started to study the genetics.
The only way really to understand what was going on was to unravel the contents of our DNA. So when the Human Genome Project announced in 2003 that it had mapped all our genes, it marked the start of a new chapter in the story of human evolution. Now, pioneering scientists are able to figure out how to change the very content of our genes. When a highly unusual mutation appeared in Central America, it presented geneticists with an enormous challenge. 41-year-old Jesus Aceves suffers from a condition known as hypertrichosis. It causes hair all over the face. The results of this rare genetic mutation have not been easy to live with.
I felt bad and told myself, why was I born this way? Especially among so many so-called normal people, you know?
Aceves is not the first one in his family to have the hypertrichosis mutation. His grandmother carried it too.
She didn't have a hair-covered face, but she had the gene. And she also had a bit of a moustache, you know? That's when it all started.
Now up to 30 members of the family have excessive hair on the face. At the Keck School of Medicine in Los Angeles, Professor Pragna Patel uses data from the Human Genome Project to find the particular faulty gene that affects just this family.
Hair is growing in places where we don't normally see hair. So clearly some signal has been disturbed that normally tells cells hair don't grow here. Studying hair growth in humans is a big challenge because the hair follicles are specified very early in development. Even the baby, you can kind of see that they are going to have it.
Patel had been studying this condition for nearly a decade when the Human Genome Project was completed.
The current approach for finding genes for rare conditions has been revolutionized because we completed the Genome Project. If a person is affected, we can tell what probability a child with the condition will have.
Both boys and girls can suffer if the mutation is handed down. Aceves has 3 daughters, all of whom have hypertrichosis.
It's really hard because they are discriminated against, they are bullied and are teased at school.
The fact that the whole family has the condition helps Patel identify the mutant gene.
What we did was we took DNA from the Mexican family and we pinpoint the cause to a single mutation.
With the faulty gene identified, there's hope of a cure and possible prevention in the future. While hypertrichosis may be difficult to live with, it's not life-threatening. Elsewhere, identifying a faulty genetic mutation has saved lives. Far out in the North Atlantic Ocean sit the Faroe Islands. This windswept archipelago has become an unlikely frontier of genetic medicine. An invisible villain plagues the isolated community. Frans Jensen suffers from a rare genetic disease known as carnitine transporter deficiency, or CTD. Caused by a genetic mutation, CTD has taken a heavy toll on his family.
This is my youngest brother, Edmund. He passed away from CTD in 2007. He was 21 years old. This is me. I got my diagnosis the day after my brother passed away.
Carnitine helps the body make energy from fats in food. In people with CTD, this doesn't happen, leading to muscle weakness, fatigue, and heart disease. Untreated, it can be fatal.
If I exert myself, I get tired easily, and sometimes, even though my head is clear and I want to work or do something, sometimes I can't even move.
Elsewhere in the world, CTD is extremely rare. On the Faroes, 1 in 300 inhabitants have the condition.
My mother was a carrier of the disease, and my father was a carrier, and I'm sick. My wife is a carrier also, and so my daughter, she's also sick.
The cause of these alarming statistics lies in the islanders' past. The Vikings arrived in the Faroes more than 1,000 years ago. Since then, few came to or left the islands, and the people became isolated. It's one of the most genetically similar communities in the Northern Hemisphere. In this isolation, the faulty CTD gene was regularly passed on. CTD can be managed if it's diagnosed and treated properly. In 2006, the Faroese health authorities set up a genetic biobank to decode the DNA of every citizen and use the data for medical treatment and research.
It is an inherited disease, so in principle you use the genetics to see which kind of CTD mutation you have, but also you could in the future screen for carrier status so people know if they have it, and you can work with it in that way.
So far, samples have been taken from more than 30,000 islanders in an unprecedented attempt to record the genes of an entire population. Knowing what's hidden in our genes allows us to make important decisions. Choices that may end up affecting the future of human evolution.
People are starting to use genetic testing to decide whether to have children or not based on those genes. And so in some populations, you actually see the rate of genetic disorders declining because they're using technology to decide whether to have children.
Could choices like these halt the process of evolution that has been operating for billions of years?
For 4 billion years, basically life worked according to what Darwin argued, which is you have natural selection and you have random mutation. What's happened over the last centuries, and particularly over the last 30 years, is we've completely changed the logic of evolution.
Today, our understanding of genetics means we can actually intervene in the natural selection process and change the DNA of a whole family. Now, when we find a mutation that can't be cured, we can try to eliminate it. Carmen Niagu suffers from an inherited genetic condition called Charcot-Marie tooth disease, or CMT.
Charcot-Marie tooth is a condition that affects your nerves, especially the ones in your extremities. There is no cure for it. There is no medication to keep it under control. There's nothing you can do.
Carmen's father also suffered from this disease of the nervous system, which starts with the hands and feet and eventually affects the whole body.
You end up not being able to walk like my father was. You end up not being able to do common tasks like being able to eat on your own.
When Carmen and husband Gabriel decided to start a family, they were keen to make sure that their own children were free of the disease.
I didn't want my baby to go through anything remotely similar that my father went through.
So they sought the advice of a geneticist.
I explained that I'm looking into having a baby and I want to know what my odds are in having a healthy baby. And she explained to us that we have a 50% chance of having a baby with CMT regardless.
To have a baby that didn't carry the CMT mutation, Carmen would have to get pregnant using IVF. About half her embryos would contain the faulty gene that causes CMT, and half would not. Using a process known as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, medics could study Carmen's embryos in search of the faulty gene.
Carmen wanted to undergo a procedure where all her embryos would be screened for the particular genetic disorder, which is CMT. These faulty genes have been passed on from one generation to the other. So technology is smart enough now to weed off this faulty gene, whereby couples can now have the option of not transmitting the faulty gene onto their children. Without having the information of all the genes that we have on the human genome, screening for this particular mutation or such mutations would not be possible. So certainly having the human genome mapped out has been a revolution.
Even then, it's a difficult task. Geneticists examined hundreds of thousands of points in the genome. They had to identify the particular mutation that causes CMT. Once Carmen and Gabriel had undergone IVF, their embryos were scanned for the mutation.
The embryos undergo a biopsy of a few cells, typically between 5 and 7 cells. And these cells that contain the DNA of the embryos is going to be tested for the particular genetic mutation for CMT.
Using a cutting-edge technique, the medics were able to isolate the CMT mutation in a matter of days. Then they selected an embryo without it. The result is baby Lucas, a true child of the 21st century.
The chances of baby Lucas existing were close to zero 50 years ago. But then humankind evolved, technology evolved. We became more open-minded, we see things differently, and this is the outcome.
What is certain is that the CMT mutation has been wiped out of Carmen's family DNA.
Yeah. My father was an only child, so it never occurred in his family again, and I'm an only child as well. So this condition in my family is going to die with me. I haven't passed it on. Lucas is absolutely healthy, which is amazing because with these kind of genetic conditions, you can't stop it in any way, but you can actually prevent it from ever occurring. So this is the future. We are going to be in a world where no more disease in the future.
Interventions like this are removing genetic conditions from individual genomes much faster than evolution could have done.
Screening of embryos for genetic disorders has become a reality. We have had women, for example, who are certainly focused on trying to eliminate the breast cancer gene from their gene pool.
These choices are just part of modern-day evolution.
We have editing technologies. We can now edit genomes. We can select embryos. All of these things can still be seen as a part of a natural selection process.
Is this new natural selection creating better offspring than nature did in the past?
Today, our technology allows us to alter DNA. We can create changes that will be inherited by future generations. And if I look to the future and say, what will happen to us? If there are big changes, they're likely to be big changes that we create. That's sort of frightening because it means that no longer is our evolution a product of nature. It's now a product of engineering.
It seems that controlling the evolution of genetic characteristics is within our grasp.
We're going to see this period of discovery continue through the next few decades. This understanding is going to provide us with many new ways to modify our health.
In 2016, Great Britain officially became the first country to allow scientists genetically to modify human embryos in the laboratory. Some believe gene editing could mark the beginning of a whole new era of human evolution.
When you talk about embryo selection, you are actually talking about babies that were actually produced in the usual way. It's just that you pick the best one. This is different. Once you start editing, then all bets are off. Then you could just go in and instead of picking the baby with the most pluses, you could just say, let's give the baby all pluses. And then the potential for producing something which is really off scale, really different from anything that came before, becomes much stronger.
At the Beijing Genomic Institute, geneticists are in active pursuit of genes that can be edited into human embryos. In particular, they're hunting for genes that relate to intelligence.
There's very good evidence that people who are exceptional, very exceptional in intelligence, that a big part of what gives them those abilities is some kind of unique genetic pattern. It's clear that it will have a huge impact on the future of the human race once this technology is available.
While these scientists race to find the genes that will enhance our minds, others continue to figure out ways to improve the evolution of our bodies. Genetic understanding combined with modern medicine ensures we now survive diseases that at one time would have killed us, increasing our chances of living well into old age.
What happened over the 20th century is we doubled the average human lifespan. And a lot of that is due to our understanding of genetics.
Throughout most of our evolutionary story, few lived longer than 2 or 3 decades. Today, as many as a third of babies born in the developed world will live well beyond 100. Now the race is on to work out how to keep their bodies healthy for most of their lives. Some of these Chinese gymnasts are more than 80 years old. Their extraordinary feats beg the question, why did human evolution enable some bodies to age well, while others do not? Again, the answer is hidden in our genes. Nobel Prize-winning molecular biologist Carol Greider studies DNA to find out why some people age better than others.
We're very interested in understanding age-related degenerative diseases, and so we're very fascinated to find out what are the new things that we can find that play a role in some of these diseases.
Greider studies chromosomes, thread-like structures that contain all of our genes. The ends of the chromosome threads are protected by structures known as telomeres.
It's very much like the plastic tip on the end of a shoelace. And if you don't have that, then it becomes unraveled.
Our bodies grow and change thanks to constant cell division. But each time our cells divide, the telomeres get shorter, and the chromosome threads start to unravel, making us vulnerable to disease.
The fact that the cells are dividing so many times and the telomeres get short, that occurs throughout a person's lifespan as that person ages. And then at older ages, you're more susceptible to these age-related diseases because the telomeres are short. There are diseases like bone marrow failure. There's also liver disease and a lung disease called pulmonary fibrosis, that when telomeres are very short, these diseases occur. What we would hope to find is something which can elongate the telomeres.
The crucial importance of keeping telomeres long is illustrated by people whose bodies are unable to do so. Inoue Saki is just 49 years old. He has a condition known as Werner syndrome, which means that his body is unable to maintain telomere length when his cells divide. Since he was first diagnosed 10 years ago, his face has altered beyond recognition. Short telomeres and DNA damage have robbed Inoue of his hair and youthful skin. They also leave him prone to cancer and atherosclerosis.
I would say that for people like me who suffer from Werner syndrome, it's like being on a super express train. What I'm trying to do is slow it down as much as I can.
It's an extreme example of what's happening in all of us. The human body has evolved to preserve the length of telomeres during cell division with an enzyme called telomerase. Molecular biologists are figuring out how to create this in the lab and inject it into defective cells.
In the cells, there's very little telomerase. So we decided that a boost of telomerase activity for a short period might lengthen the telomeres. We were surprised by how well it does. It's like pushing the gas pedal on the car.
That's how we're using the telomere length, to understand who is at risk for disease. If you change the telomeres, then you're going to be able to help the people with those diseases to not get disease. So you will change their lifespan. Those individual people, they will live longer.
As we begin to understand our genetics, as we begin to understand telomeres, as we begin to understand different parts of the aging process, we'll still continue to die, but hopefully take our bodies back to younger states.
Medics are not only looking at genetics to keep our bodies fit and youthful. They're also studying them to invent new techniques to build whole new organs. Advances in tissue engineering and molecular biology could ultimately enable us to build future humans. As we live longer, scientists hope to bypass the aging process by replacing worn-out body parts. It's a field known as regenerative medicine.
Regenerative medicine is really trying to harness the ability of the body to heal itself. The challenge is what happens when the body does not regenerate because of disease or injury.
Organ transplantation is nothing new. For centuries, medics have been searching for ways to successfully move organs from one body to another. The quest continued throughout the 20th century. Doctors carried out the first successful kidney transplant in the 1950s. But 6 decades later, long waiting lists and organ rejection mean many still die. Recent advances in stem cell technology could make established organ transplantation redundant. Biologists once believed that stem cells found in embryos were the only cells that could turn themselves to any function required by the body. Now they can take adult cells and re-engineer them in the laboratory to make stem cells. These can then be used to make many of the body's specialized cells. This is the basis of regenerative medicine, and another bold move in the evolution of us. Pioneers in the field are using stem cell technology to figure out how to grow organs from your own body.
The current challenge right now is to create tissues and organs using your very own cells so that we can create organs on demand and without rejection.
We're now beginning to develop instruments where we can change more and more of our body parts because each of our cells contains our entire genetic code. And we're now learning how to make those body parts.
The reality of rebuilding a human body with tissues generated from its own cells is a distant one, but it's well underway. And when it arrives, it will radically alter future generations of humans. For more than a decade, scientists have been able to turn stem cells into beating heart cells in the laboratory. Dr. Harold Ott is now working on building a customized human heart.
What we try to do is we try to engineer functional organs for transplantation. If we can sort of create tailor-made organs, so personalized organs on demand, you could see you undergoing many replacement procedures in order to extend your life expectancy.
The bioengineers start with the scaffold that nature provides, taking a heart from a donor or animal. Then they flush all the cells and genetic material out of it.
What that process entails is detergent solutions that wash out all the cells. You end up with a framework of the organ amongst those hearts, lungs, and kidneys.
Then stem cells are taken from the recipient and grown onto the heart scaffold to create a fully functioning new heart that carries the patient's own DNA. The hope is that organs grown in the laboratory like this can be transplanted without rejection.
Ideally, you'd be walking into the hospital in need for a kidney, and doctors would take a cell biopsy, a tissue biopsy from you, and then create the necessary regenerative cells from that tissue biopsy. So in the end, that won't be rejected.
In this kind of medical emergency, speed is an issue. So surgeon Anthony Atala is using a 3D printer to build a transplantable organ.
Instead of laying the cells down by hand one layer at a time, you do it with a printer one layer at a time. But instead of using ink, you're using cells.
This way, organs can be made to order. And perhaps a laboratory-built human could be within sight.
I think it's a very bright future, and I think ultimately it will lead to new treatments and revolutionize medicine.
The human body has traveled a long way in the past 4 million years, since the first humans walked the Earth. No one knows where evolution will take us next. Perhaps with enough scientific progress, humans might one day live forever.